Hey, everybody, and welcome back to God is Not a Theory. Today, I have with me Tim Wimber, the son of John Wimber. And Tim and I have known each other for, I'm not sure, but well over 40 years, maybe 42 plus. And I asked him to come on the show because people are always interested in hearing about not only my history, but the early days of the Vineyard and so forth. And I thought it would be a just a very interesting show for many of you to hear from John and Carol's son, some of the background and his own background as well. He has his own fascinating story of navigating through the various phases of life as a believer, and life as a Christian in a church world. So we're going to have a lot to talk about today. Tim, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm
So
glad to be here.
yeah, I'm glad to have you. And it was fortuitous that we were side by side. I could have texted you, but anyway, I was with you at an event, and I thought, I really need to have Tim on the show. I've been wanting to do this for a while. So anyway, I popped the question, and Tim said yes. How about that?
Yes, that's true.
So let's start out with just some basic background. I just introduced you as John and Carol Wimber's son, but tell us a little bit about you. Who is Tim Wimber, and how did you yourself come to faith?
Well, I was the second son. I had an older brother, Chris, who died at 40 of cancer. So it was yeah, and honestly, a lot of the thing was we were this healing church, and my brother dying wasn't easy. But I then went on to kind of just I've always been compliant. I've always been trying not to be noticed. I've always tried not to be a bother to my parents or to anybody. So I tried to pretty much stay in the background, but it wasn't easy being John's son. Everybody wanted to know John's son. So
I think one of the, I don't know, occupational hazard isn't exactly the right word, but when we use that language, people know what we mean. So I'll
yes.
use it here, but I know it's somewhat misplaced. But one of the occupational hazards of being the son of John and Carol Wimber is not only do people want to maybe move in on you, but sometimes they want to play you in order to get to them. And so I'm sure you have had your share of those encounters with people.
Yeah, and honestly, I think a lot of people would uh a lot of my relationships were totally nothing to do with me. Some people were mad because I was John's son and they wanted to be. I mean,
Hmm.
there was a lot of that going on too, a lot of jealousy and a lot of all that stuff. But I got to tell you, it wasn't easy being John's son. I mean, it wasn't like my dad um, was what he seemed to be from stage. He was really good in front of 10,000 people, but he was not very good in front of four people.
Hmm.
You know, he was a showman because he'd spent all his life on a stage. And I mean, he started professionally as a musician at 14 and never really uh, developed a good stage presence. He was just really good at at not getting phased by anything that happened. That's why he was so good during these conferences and all this wild stuff was happening. And he looked like he was totally calm and in control, but inside he was just as freaked out as we were.
Well, one of the things that they'll tell you in any leadership school or any management school is, and you see these signs everywhere, and it's become kind of a meme now in our society. Keep calm and carry on. And
Yeah.
so John was very good at doing that. Although, if you listen to what he said in his various sermons here and there, he would talk about when he was panicking, when the Holy Spirit fell, when Lonnie was ministering, or, he'd run into situations and he'd be praying under his breath, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God. So he did disclose that, but of course he did it in such a humorous way. I think people tended to be dismissive of it.
Yes. I think a lot of people thought that this was an idea my dad came up and then executed it. But this really happened to him just like it happened to any of us.
Yeah.
He he never planned for any of that. He definitely didn't. I mean, it was a major ordeal when Lonnie Frisbee came to on Mother's Day and spoke. He almost quit the church after that. I mean, not many people would. Everybody think, oh, but that's who we are. That's body ministry. Everybody gets to play. Well, that was true, but he never really understood the whole thing of being overwhelmed by the Spirit. I mean, we were Quakers.
Yeah.
We didn't understand that. I mean, I think the original Quakers would have understood it, but we were from an evangelical dispensationalist background. We didn't have any idea of the power of God, and we had no Pentecostal theology to do it either. And my dad didn't. My dad had studied a lot of churches, and he'd been working in church growth for a long time, but he didn't know how to take that. That's the most he'd ever seen.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there is this thing called divine sovereignty. And sometimes the Lord just puts his hand on somebody. And I'll editorialize here for just a second on a theological issue that seems to come up a lot. Many times when people think about sovereignty, they think it means whether you are elected unto heaven or hell. And this is directly a result of the teaching of John Calvin and
Yeah.
been carried forward by Reformed churches of various stripes for 500 years. But when I think of sovereignty, when I look at the passages, for example, in Romans that talk about God either raising people up or putting them down, it always seems to have to do with the purposes of God in the earth. And it never seems to mention whether people are predestined to heaven or hell. So, God put his hand on, well, the Vineyard movement, but your dad and also your mom, and used them to bring something to the wider church with which they were, at least initially, quite uncomfortable. But God has an amazing sense of humor too. I think sometimes he sits in the heaven and he laughs at our own sense of chaos when he does what he does.
Yes. Well, I thinking back about everything, and this might be an interesting standpoint. I don't think my dad really liked the job he was given. I think if he could have done something else, he would have. When my parents were seeking God, the guy that was leading them, through the different phases, trying to get them to become true disciples of Christ, he wouldn't let them off. He made them really Christians.
Yeah.
It wasn't about getting decisions. He didn't wait for the first possible moment that they would pray the sinner's prayer. He literally kept on him and kept telling him the price. And to the point that my father at a point said, well, I know this guy and he can't do anything but music. Would he have to give up the music business to get Christ? And the answer was, well, you'd have to talk. That would be between them and him and God.
Yeah.
And so when my dad had, my dad was, by all outside appearances, doing very well. He's only 28, and he had 4 albums in the top 100 on Billboard. And he had it was kind of a compromise. He'd been a jazz musician, but he hated rock and roll. But he started a band that was, although 2 white guys, they sounded more like black rhythm and blues, which is what he could accept. So he had 4 albums. He had it all set up. And then to obtain the pearl, he gave it all up. And so he really gave it all up. He didn't have any other talent. According to his best friend, Dick Hine, John couldn't even speak English. He could only speak musician. And so he spoke like a beatnik, Dick would have to translate for him. Dick, being an older friend and wanting him to get saved too, would translate for him. So when my dad made the decision. He made the decision to sell everything he had, basically, and literally he made 1/10 what he made the year before when he quit. In 62, he made $75,000, and in 63, he made $7,000.
Wow.
So he really paid the price. But of course, to us, we didn't care. I mean, we're little kids.
Right.
We were glad that Dad didn't sleep during the day anymore, because being a musician, he'd stay up all night, and he'd wait. My mom would wake us up about 2:30 in the morning when he got home from work. As a kid, my dad had been raised as an only child, and so he really did enjoy family, but he had no idea how to be a dad because he didn't have a dad.
Yeah.
I mean, he was, and it's funny because everybody keeps saying, well, John's my spiritual father. And I thought that's interesting. I wish he was mine. He just wasn't very good one-on-one with people. Now, but what he was obedient. And so he would take on people that he saw that God's hand was on, and he would lead them, and he would spend time with them, and he would be the person they needed to be. So I think it's all very interesting. My parents didn't have any religion when they got saved. They didn't know any religion. They had, I can still remember my mother. I mean, this is like, we're still just in the Friends Church. The car wouldn't start. So I remember my mom coming out in her bathrobe and sticking her hand right in the middle of the hood of the car and going, start. And it would start. I remember my little brother, some of the neighborhood kids had talked him into knocking over a bee box, and the bees had swarmed all over him, and he was getting stung. And it was probably 2.5. Come running down the street, and my parents, he must have been stung like 80 or 90 times. And my parents just wiped the bees off him and then prayed for him, and they felt like it was going to be all right. They didn't even take him to the hospital. Maybe my parents were just, reckless. I don't think so. But I think they really did believe in the power of prayer because they had already seen it so much.
Right.
Yet they were in a dispensationalist church that wouldn't have believed most of this stuff. They wouldn't have believed, especially in healing. That was all just in the New Testament. That was all just to start it. So it was very interesting that in later, and matter of fact, my father was walking along an irrigation ditch in Yorba Linda. They had big irrigation ditches because it was a city that was full of grows. They were all growers, grew oranges and avocados and everything else. And he came home and told my mom, he said, Carol, I was walking, I was praying, and all of a sudden I wasn't praying in English. And my mom said, the devil's got you. And sure enough, he talked to the senior pastor of the church he was going to, and they said, what you need is education. You need to be educated. But he could always speak in tongues. And so he was very against it. And so I can remember I was very angry at my dad every time he sang out in tongues or anything when the church started, because I kind of felt like he needed to apologize to me, like for never going back and teaching me the opposite of what he believed before. It was a big deal. So and honestly, even when the church, the meeting, okay, let me say this right. My father was being told by his friends and by random people that he was supposed to go start a church. So he naturally assumed it was going to be a friend's church because that's the church we were going to. But he went to the superintendent, and the superintendent said, no, you speak in tongues. And he did speak in tongues, but he hadn't spoken tongues in 10 years, and at least not any event. He just tested out every once in a while. And he said, okay. So now he didn't know what he was going to do. And the the church we were going to, he had personally saved more than half of the people that attend the church, because when he couldn't do music, he eventually got a job as a salesman, and he would sell a collection agency to doctors' offices and other professionals. And so he'd get to know the secretaries, and he'd invite them to his Bible studies. And he was teaching 10 Bible studies every week, just to
That's a
different
lot.
groups of people. So it was, he was practicing. He really knew John, because that's all he ever taught was John, because it was, that way you could know the whole book and be able to go back and forth.
Yep.
But when the church was not liking what was going on, there was a meeting, because my mom really is the visionary. My mom was the one that believed. God gave her a vision and told her what was supposed to happen with my dad, what my dad was supposed to do, kind of what his calling was. And and how her saying that the devil's got you, and stopping his normal path had stopped this thing. And she started crying. And then my dad came home, because he was working for Fuller by then, and in the church growth department. And he was traveling around the country. So he'd be gone for 3 weeks, home for 2 weeks, and then gone again for, something like that. And he said, be nice to your mom, she's having a nervous breakdown, and then leaves. And I thought, well, that's not very good, Dad. Why don't you stay home? Your wife's having a nervous breakdown. But what was really happening is she's repenting, because she had stopped what God wanted to do. So because of that, she was praying that it would all happen. So because of that, because of her repenting, all of her friends in her ladies' Bible study were getting together after Sunday night church and repenting for being pharisaical and being hard-hearted and not letting the Holy Spirit have any leeway in their lives. And it became very popular. It became Carl Tuttle. It was at Carl Tuttle's sister's house and his brother-in-law's house, and they would pray and sing worship songs that Carl would lead. And eventually it became so crowded, if you wanted to actually get in the house or be able to even see what was going on, you would skip Sunday night church. Well, once people started skipping Sunday night church, the ministering council, the board that ran the church, sent down the senior pastor and to stop it. And when Barney Schaefer didn't, they fired him for it. I mean, Barney had nothing to do with it at all. He wouldn't have, but they fired him because they weren't obedient. He wasn't obedient to the board, I guess. But I am very appreciative that it cost Barney something for just being honest.
Yeah.
Anyway, that because they fired Barney on Monday, they called my parents in on Tuesday and said, we want you to leave the church. And my dad had only been at the meeting twice. He wasn't even part of it. It was my mom's meeting. My dad was gone too much still. But they took it as that he was the leader, because he was John Wimber, I guess. I don't know. And personally had been so big in this friend's church. And they asked him to leave. So it wasn't like that definitely wasn't the plan. So he'd already tried to be a friend's church, and he thought, okay, we'll just meet in the park on Sunday. Well, it starts raining on Wednesday, and it is literally, the park is now a lake. It's like 4 feet deep in the middle, and he's thinking, oh no, what are we going to do now? My dad knew a couple people from Fuller that were Calvary Chapel people. They were Don and John McClure. Well, Don was already leading the retreat center up in Arrowhead, where we had a cabin. And so, yeah, that makes sense. You can become a Calvary, you can come to Calvary Chapel. And my dad had never been in a Calvary Chapel. So he didn't know what they looked like. He didn't know what it was. But he figured, okay, well, this works out because they were going to give him a bank account and a 501c3 and give him some some materials to run church, offering baskets and everything else. So he says, okay, but it's raining now and there's a lake and they can't meet in the park. And somebody offered to let us use the Masonic Lodge. So yes, it is true. The Vineyard really is a cult. It started in the Masonic Lodge. But I think that that's even more so. It's like Jesus being born in a manger. I think God does that because, we knew what that looked like. And my dad had been changed. My dad had had an experience with God, and he kind of knew where we were going, but he didn't really know. But he did know that this was God, and he was supposed to do whatever it is. He'd already gotten to the point where he knew it wasn't him at all. He knew that he was going to have to do whatever God was doing.
Right.
He really did. And at any moment, if God had changed direction, and honestly, he already was doing something. He was teaching and saying things that he didn't really believe, but it was what was in the Bible. So he had to believe it. He'd say, "Yeah, I know, but it's what the Bible says. So I have to I have to teach that. I can't teach what I expect." So anyway, so we're calling ourselves Calvary Chapel Yorba Linda because we're a Calvary Chapel. We're meeting in the Masonic Lodge, and my dad, we sang for 45 minutes, and my dad preached for 15, and he talked about how we'll always be known as a bastard because we came out of this thing where we got kicked out of the church. But Jesus was probably thought of as a bastard. He knew that mom was pregnant before they got married.
Yeah.
So if Mary was pregnant, that probably tainted. I mean, I don't know how big Nazareth was, and I don't know how, but I assume it was like the city I grew up in, where everybody knew everybody and everybody knew everybody else's business. So I thought, oh, okay, now we've lost all dignity. And that's kind of the way it was, is that I think God did that on purpose. He needed to keep us where we couldn't point at anything that we did to make any of it happen, because none of it was normal. None of it. And it kind of just happened. It just kept happening and happening. And to the point, my dad was a church growth expert. I mean, that's what he was doing for a living. And he said, "Carol, we're not doing anything right. Nothing right." And the church keeps growing. And he was like kind of annoyed because it was like it was going against what he believed. Like, we can't be doing this and have the church grow. We would get kicked out of one venue and have to move to another. And this was before the internet or even cell phones, you know what I mean? There was no way to let everybody know. And the church would still grow. We would gather people by moving, the numbers wouldn't drop at all. So it was an interesting time.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So when all this was going on, though, you're a kid, and how old were you, let's say, when, I don't know, you left the former church and you're opening this new church in the Masonic Lodge? How old were you at that time?
I just turned, I would have, I might have, no, I was still 17. I'd already graduated from high school. And I had not been going to the Friends Church because I was so disappointed in it. They had like clamped down on the fun stuff. I mean, I just kind of, we just wanted to be kids. So
Yeah.
all my buddies and me, the Friends Church had motorcycle club of dirt bikes, so we'd all go out in the desert and ride together. And it was named after the senior pastor. It was Barney's Bikers. So we had all go out in the desert, and it was like a lot of fun. And they were getting less and less tolerant of kind of uncouth teenagers that were coming. At one point, well, like in my junior high, this is not a very big church. We had a junior high group of 350 kids in a church of maybe 500. That's all it was, but 350 kids. So kids from all over were coming to at the junior hires were coming, and that was just 7th and 8th grade. So it was probably half of the junior high was coming on Wednesday nights to our group. But so we'd had quite a draw. It was at the beginning of the Jesus People movement, so people are getting saved very easily, and even into the Friends Church, So I can remember back when my dad was a musician and we were living in Las Vegas, and so I can remember that, and I can remember the transition to moving to Yorba Linda, and I kept asking him why. He says, well, that's where God lives. I said, I don't, Dad, who's God and why are we following him? And, who is this guy? And I'm like 3, it was a great place for a boy to grow up because it was horses and motorcycles and tractors. And, it was a fun place. It was living out in the middle of nowhere. And, it was fun, but it was, to me, I couldn't understand. I found out when I was a little bit older that he had been asked to go on tour with the Beatles, and he turned it down because he couldn't miss Tuesday night Bible study. And I think he'd already known he had to get out of the music business. And I can remember that whole thing, like, Dad, you could have introduced me to the Beatles. Like
Yeah.
you could have known, because we already had Bill Medley and Bobby Hatfield coming around periodically, and I knew that they had been famous. Of course, I didn't know my dad's music because it's my dad's music. It's like my dad was always playing music. My dad always was. He was a musician first, and he was definitely not an academic second. I think that it was probably a couple things down the line, but he tried because he was supposed to. He was told that he needed to become more academic. So
Interesting. So when in the midst of all that, you've got this youth group, and you were saying Yorba Linda's a pretty cool place to be a boy, or
yes,
maybe adolescent, later a young man. There's tractors, there's motorcycles. I remember some conversations about even hunting in the area, although, as things got more developed, that dropped away. There's horses. You've got all this going on. When did God get a hold of you?
well, I did grow up in a very much a an evangelical church, and we had a church camp. My dad did the family camp every year. He was leader of it, but it was Quaker Meadow, and Quaker Meadow was up in the sequoias, and so they got those huge trees, and it was a great place to go. And of course, I would feel God's presence and longing, and so I'd get saved about every other year. You know, it's just kind of what it was. But by the time I think that I was junior high, I understood that this is, that I know that I need God, and I don't know why, but I know that I need him because I know that nothing else is ever going to feel real, that everything else is going to feel like I'm waiting to trust God. So why not trust him now? I don't know how else to explain it. I wasn't particularly popular as a redhead, and they used to give me all sorts of grief. and I was way too big because I grew too fast. By the time I was a freshman in high school, I was 6'1", but I only weighed 130 pounds. So I was, skinny, redhead, and people could make their points by cold cocking me when I wasn't looking. So I got my share of feeling abused, but knowing there has to be something more. My parents, in an effort to kind of save us, kind of kept us away from the things that were natural to us in some ways. My mom, luckily, was not afraid of motorcycles because her brothers and her dad were motorcycle people.
Okay.
And she wasn't afraid of us going around out in the hills behind where I lived. I remember telling her, I was sliding down a hill. We were trying to play like rappelling down the rock face. So we found a rock face to rappel down. When I got to the bottom, I was brushing off my shirt and a big scorpion fell out of my shirt. So I took it home, showed my mom. She goes, "Oh, that's nice." She wasn't afraid at all. My little brother, when he was about 10, maybe 11, in an effort to make a little bit of money, he'd go up in the hills with a pillowcase and a stick, and he'd collect rattlesnakes, put them in the pillowcase, take them home, kill them, and tack them up to my little sister's playhouse, and then sell the skins to the feed store in town. There was a feed store because of horses, and everything. And it was just kind of the way it was. Of course, there was nothing to entertain us, no movie theaters or anything. So when I can remember being about 10, I went into the hardware store, and they would sell me 22 shells at 10.
Yeah.
I mean, that to me now as a grandpa in this age, there's no possible way they would sell bullets to 10-year-olds. But
That's right.
they sold them to me. They sold me arrows and bullets and well, and wrist rocket slingshots. That's
Yep.
what I remember buying from him. So it was a place where, they were still hitching posts on Main Street, so the ranchers could eat at the cafe there, that kind of thing. It was just it was Hicksville. There was nothing going on, and now it's like, I don't know, 750,000 people. It's just a ton of people, way
Yeah.
more, and definitely not the kind of place it is now. Then, when we grew up there, I knew what time it was because the train still went by and blew the whistle twice a day, 9 o'clock in the morning and 9 o'clock at night. So I knew I was in real trouble if I didn't get home by 9 o'clock at night.
What a
Oh, mom's gonna kill me.
yeah. What a
So
fascinating story. And also this thing of getting home at 9 o'clock that you could be out wandering around and no one was particularly concerned. I mean, I think it's really important to hear these stories because our audience, they're living in modernity. And as you said, nobody would let you, buy shells or bullets for a 22 rifle today. There's laws in California that forbid the purchase of ammunition if you're under 21.
yeah.
So it just couldn't happen. But I have my own version of that. I grew up down South Orange County, and I used to carry a shotgun to school when I was in high school, and I would hunt on the way to school. When I got there, the principal would take the gun from me, and he would take any game I had shot and put it in the faculty lounge in the freezer. And then after school, he would walk me to the edge of the campus, give me back my game and my gun, and I'd walk home and I'd hunt on the way home. And there was no drama, no tactical team. I never shot the school up. It was Orange County in the 1970s. Uh, I don't know what to say. It just the mentality has changed. And I guess some people are crazier because of the things we put in front of them and the way we've programmed our society. But it was a simpler, easier time for sure.
Well, I also think that your familiarity with with guns and just that whole culture of hunting, and nobody thought anything of it. I mean, I for years drove around and I always had a shotgun behind the back seat of my truck. I'm a pool man. And so after my pool route, my buddies and me would meet and shoot trap just for fun. It was
Yeah.
just kind of what we did. Every day we'd shoot, a couple rounds of trap, and it was it was just an activity. Might as well have gone bowling.
Yeah.
But now I kind of realized, hey, I probably would have gotten in trouble because of all the guns I just had underneath the seat of my car. You
Yeah.
know, that now I kind of realized that, once I started hearing stories about people being pulled over, and them finding guns in the glove compartment. Why, I had way more guns than what would fit in the glove compartment in my truck, because we were going to go do stuff. We were going to go shoot at tin cans and shoot trap and skeet, and and get really good at it, so that when it's time to shoot pheasant, we'll be able to hit them. So
Yep. Yep. That I know that world. So again, I think it's really important for people to hear this. Not, I mean, about you, about America then. We don't have a lot of conversations like this on this show, but there's something of what we call the Christian mindset, at least in Bible Belt America, and the ethos of America that is still there's some of us around who still remember all this, and there are still pockets of America where that exists.
there was a time where you would just assume everybody had a Christian understanding.
Right.
And I can still remember um, making comments to people like, I'm sorry, I'll pray about it. I heard about your mother. I'll be praying for her. And I was, you know, 10 and 12 years old when I was saying that, because it was just part of normal life. And I never thought about it as they could possibly not believe in God, because I
Yeah.
thought everybody believed in God. It was never a question. I mean, it was like, they could have been of some denomination that my parents didn't approve of, but I never thought, well, they're all going to let me pray for them, you know. So it was definitely a different time and a different mindset, and America was really one nation under God, and in God we trust was on the money for some reason. So I just assumed everybody in America had an understanding that what the the most, I knew it wasn't everybody, but I did know that it was understood that this was a nation where the people that were running it believed in God, and
Yeah.
and was willing to name him as a reason why we do things.
Absolutely. I remember that too. My stories are more Michigan based than California based, but it's pretty much the same story. Um, all right, so let's transition here. In the Vineyard movement, the term OG has come into popular use, and depending on who you're talking with, it either means old guard or original gangster. Uh, I don't know. Given what we've just been talking about, maybe it's the latter. But anyway, it's become a popular term, and obviously, there's nobody who's more OG than you are, except your younger brother and your sister, uh,
Yep.
because you're the family of John and Carol Wimber, and I guess we could throw the Gullicksons into that same group.
which
So
is which
anyway,
is always surprising to people, because I tell them, no, we weren't the original Vineyard. My
yeah,
dad didn't start the Vineyard movement. It was Chuck Smith that said to my dad, you're more like Ken Gullickson. Why don't you be a Vineyard?
yeah,
And it was because Ken was the church that had Bob Dylan in it. You know what I
right,
mean? He had the musicians in his church, and my dad loved worship. My dad thought that every generation has to have his own hymns. So we sang a lot more than Calvary Chapels did. We sang a lot more than most churches did. my dad had talked about before even starting the church. I remember him coming back, and he had experienced, like, in the Bronx, New York, that they would start a service, and the way they knew they did it, they started a bonfire in front of the theater. And when they could see the smoke coming up, that meant church was on. They would come down, he said, and they sang the same song for over an hour. And I
Wow.
said, they did? Doesn't it get boring? He says, not to them, it didn't. And he was surprised by it. I mean, he was really baffled by the whole experience. And he started, I think God put this hunger in his heart, like, what is it? What is it that needs to happen? Because I know for sure. Now, my parents would have never admitted it, but I knew for sure my dad thought he was going to die of a heart attack. And he was trying to get enough money together to take care of my mom, because he had doctors that told him he wasn't going to live past, well, they told him he wasn't going to live past 38, but they had also told him that he wasn't going to live past 35 because his
Mm.
blood pressure was just astronomically high. And, it was, something was going to explode someplace. And, so he just worked his butt off to pay for enough life insurance to take care of my mom. But then he started thinking, because remember, all that healing stuff didn't happen anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, it was really kind of like, too bad you missed it, you know. But see, my dad read the Bible and believed it. So he had seen God do things that God doesn't do anymore, according to his elders. And so he always kind of knew. And he'd also, because of Peter Wagner taking him to all these churches and all these different denominations, all these different experiences. I mean, he'd been in a snake church, and he'd been in like I said, the church in the Bronx, where they start a bonfire to tell you church has started. And he'd been in the high church that was all very, very formal, and incense and the whole thing. And he kind of knew what he wanted. And he used to talk about the church that I want. I'm building the church I want. And it was because that's what he wanted. You know, he wanted a church where people could come in and feel at ease. He wanted contemporary music because we forget Old English. We don't know what some of those hymns mean anymore.
Right.
We don't have a sense, you know, Amazing Grace is a great song, but it's nothing new. And people need something new. So he was a huge proponent of hymns written for every generation, and all that. So he was already building up a list of things that he really wanted to have in churches. But he had to, I mean, he even prayed about it. Okay, so tell you how this is really working. He would pray about everything, and God would let him do it. He wanted to write songs because you got to understand this. My dad didn't think in words. He thought in melodies. If he was daydreaming, melodies were going through his head. That was what it was. So he probably could have written, hundreds of songs a day if he wanted to. And honestly, that's how when my parents first quit the music business, how they made their money is that my dad would have written the score for some movie or something, and it would play it on the TV, and they would get $75 royalties for playing the movie because of his music. So, what I mean? It was just kind of part of our lives. We he was really the one the one thing I'm really proud of him for is he was obedient. I mean, he gave up everything when asked to do it, and didn't do anything without God's permission. God didn't probably have to slap him down very often. He's had to slap me down a few times, tell me to get back in my place. But I don't think so much my dad. I think my dad was aware enough, and that's why he was so good at the supernatural and getting words for people. Because if words were going through his head, it had to be God, because it wouldn't have been him. His natural state was melodies. So when words went through his head, he assumed they were from God and a word of knowledge. So,
It's so interesting just sitting talking to you. I've known you a long time. I've never had this kind of conversation with you, but what's coming through loud and clear is that God is in the ordinary of life if you
yes,
if you can actually pay attention and hear him.
yes. It's like our friend Steve Nicholson.
Mhm.
He's talking about administrating, the Holy Spirit in his meetings. But what he's talking about is the most practical things, like don't let them all gather along because that takes too long. You want church to be over at the same time so you can relieve the children's workers. And I told him that was the best meeting I went to at this thing we were just at, because it was the most practical thing. Nobody ever talks about it. We're all trying to talk about, people being raised from the dead, and and how and the glory, and well, yes, that's all true too. I love it when I see people healed. I'm excited about it. But what I want to learn about is just the practical things of life. If you're running a church, you got to run a church, and you can't treat your children's workers bad. So if somebody does something to say, hey, this will help you to always end on time so that your children's workers aren't mad at you for keeping everybody, that is just a huge deal to me. It's just the practical thing. So I God is practical. He can be supernatural. He can do all this wonderful stuff, but he can also just be practical.
Just amazing. I love this. All right. Um, a lot of times people believe that they know public figures because of what's available, whether in the press, nowadays on social media, what's on YouTube as old recordings. So, it might be easy for people to believe that they are familiar with, well, anybody really. It just depends on who they're focusing on. Um, but maybe give us a vignette of you've kind of taken us there already, but we're right at the doors. Tell us something maybe funny or insightful about the way your dad, we could say, or your mom, thought about God, faith, or church that maybe people don't know.
Well, I think probably the most important thing is that, oh, my dad used to talk about, because he was a church growth person. You talk about making your 5-year plan. We never followed any plan. Everything was just happening as fast as it could, and we'd make decisions based on, well, 51% positive, 49% positive. Okay, we'll go 51. And we'd pray, and God would just God makes us live by faith. He never tells us to the last minute, does he? And and that was what was good, is that my dad learned that God is God, and he will stop him from doing things wrong, but he's going to wait till the last possible moment to to make the decisions, because he doesn't want to go the wrong direction. I mean, there were plenty of times when we were growing the church, and we were trying to get a building, because I mean, the church, the average age was in 20s.
Yeah.
The reason why the Mother's Day in 1980 was such a big deal is because Lonnie asked for everybody 25 years and younger. That was 90% of the church. I mean, there wasn't many people over 25 in the church.
Right.
And when that whole thing happened, we were, so I guess what I'm saying is that it was never a ton of money growing in. The one thing I like about the church I'm going to now is everybody tithes, because it's mature. They're a bunch of mature people, but kids are not very good at being mature and tithing.
And
And
often they don't have money to give. I mean, they're barely
that's right. They're just living enough to, they're going through school, and once they pay their tuition and housing and eat, they don't have any money. So, I mean, all that's true, but I got to tell you that my dad was good at not worrying about us. He had faith that God would work through us just like he worked through him. When asked to go to England to talk to um, David Watson, they didn't want the kids to come. They didn't want the team. They just wanted my dad. And I said, then I'm not coming.
Yeah.
He said, why? He says, because it is the team. That is my ministry team. That's who prays. Now, he made us all pay for our own way to go, which
Right.
was fine. And he got us all there, and we're going to go to David Pitch's church in Chorleywood, which is a very nice church. It was very clean and new and everything. And he's saying, now, when you go in there, don't do this, and be really respectful, and and don't use these words or these terms. And then he goes, wait a minute, be yourself. God made him take it all back, because he was going to live with what God did. He was going to live with what God provided, and we were the ministry team. Now, you would think that all of us were good at it. One of the major problems for me is I thought I was going to be found out, because I had no success praying for the sick at all, and I was, my and I'm thinking they're going to think I know what I'm doing. But I had somebody told me, if you speak in tongues, if you pray in tongues, it'll build you up spiritually. So literally a week before the team got there, we were in London staying with my wife's grandmother in Wimbledon, and I was praying in tongues constantly under my breath, and because I really needed it. And so we would go, and it was amazing, because I'd raised my hand up, and people would be changed, and they would all break down, and these really stoic English, really proper people would just weep bitterly. And I thought, wow, this must have really worked. But then I realized, no, it would have worked no matter what, because it was all God. It was all totally. And it was the first place I ever gave out a word of knowledge, was in York at David Watson's church. And I thought I blew it. I thought, okay, I'm going to do this. And so I get a word, and it's like a really short word. Somebody's hurt their shin playing soccer. And then when I said it, is somebody has a spiral fracture of their shin from playing football. And then I told them what the doctor said. And then I told them what the prognosis was and how long it's going to, and what the possibility of having so much damage that the bone wasn't going to ever be right again, that kind of stuff. And I kept saying in my mind, shut up, Tim, shut up. Don't stop talking. You're saying way too much. Man, I kept talking. And then when I was done, I didn't see anything. And I thought, oh no, I really am a false prophet. I really am. And then so we spent the rest of the week there, and I'd seen a lot of really cool stuff. I saw people with who had polio, and their bones were all bent up, straighten out, and I heard the bones straightening out like wood creaking on a boat or something. Sound like, and then their leg would be straight, and their muscle would fill out, and they wouldn't have to wear the steel braces anymore to walk. Anyway, so we're standing on the platform to go back to London, to get on a plane to go back to California. And my mom says, well, how'd it go? And he says, well, it was all good except for that whole false prophet thing. And she goes, what do you mean? He says, I had that word about the guy that with the broken shin. And she says, oh, that guy got totally healed. And I said, really? He says, well, you probably couldn't see him because he couldn't go into the church. The church had doors on the pews. There's no way he could have gotten out of his wheelchair and gotten into a pew if he had to. And so he was back by the door. And I thought, oh. And my mom says, if you ever worry about it, it's probably, that's the devil trying to tell you. And if you ever worry about it, that's probably the one person that really got healed, because the devil wants to stop you. And I learned that I had, like I said, I had very little success. The whole thing with is that one of the questions, if you want to know, is that I recently found out that my parents had been praying against me ever being in the ministry. Not recent, like 4 years ago, I found that out. And it made total sense, because they didn't want me to have to go through the same pain of being a pastor as they had to go through. So it was kind of in a loving sense, but it really messed me up, because the only thing I ever wanted to do was being in ministry, you know.
Yeah.
And so I now that my mom's gone, now I'm not gonna. Now I'm less held back, you know. I, you know, and my mom says, "Well, it's not like we stopped you." I said, "No, you did stop me. God is going to listen to the prayers of John and Carol Wimber, even if the prayers of Tim Wimber are. What am I supposed to do?" You know?
Well, I can remember your dad on multiple occasions saying, if you can do anything other than be in the ministry, you should do
Yeah,
that.
he
And
did say that a lot.
yeah, and I've heard other people who had large and substantial ministries make comparable comments. They didn't quite word it the same way. Everyone has his or her own way of saying those things, but it's the same message for sure. Um, but you know, it's funny when you're sharing these stories, I can hear your dad and your mom's voice in my head,
Yeah.
because the way, even the way you're phrasing it is so authentic to the way that they spoke, that I'm like, wow, this is really wild.
It was, I mean, seriously, what, like I said, if my dad had had his choice on what to do for the kingdom, he would have put together and started arranging and doing big band worship, because it's what he liked. He liked big band blues. He wanted to have a horn section in every church. And instead, it stayed guitars and keyboards. You know what I mean? But
Yeah,
if he could have, there would have been somebody wailing on sax doing his leads. You know, it would have been, that's who he was.
yeah.
But, and matter of fact, at the end of his life, after he'd given away everything, what he started working on is an opera about the disciples. I wish I could find it someplace, you know. Now that my mom's gone, and I guess my mom doesn't have it either, because I couldn't find it. I couldn't find all the papers and work. So I'm hoping someday to find out what because he'd gotten a few of the disciples done. I wonder what it sounded like.
That's a fascinating idea. What an interesting way to tell the story of, all these people whom Jesus called.
Well, like I said, my dad thought first in music.
Yeah,
So he was very impressed by, I mean, although there was a lot of grief when Jesus Christ Superstar came out. But my dad said, well, wait a minute. At least it gets people thinking about Jesus. Like, that's not a bad thing to get people to think about Jesus. And yes, it's true that that wasn't a true representation of all it is, but any representation of Christ is probably not right exactly. I mean, I do like what's been coming out in The Chosen, because it shows Jesus, as I think he probably really was, a more friendly guy. I
yeah,
think he was, I think he probably had fun,
yeah.
you know. I mean, after all, he was, when you go to a wedding, you dance. You know what I mean? So I think he probably did that stuff. And I think it also makes it clear that he loved people, and he was mad at the church for not recognizing him. I think they didn't like the church leaders because they took advantage of people.
Yes.
So so all the stuff, all the times he's angry, it's because people got shut out. He came to die for the entire world. And so my personal thing is, that I treat everybody like they're his. He paid for them. And so I start telling him things on the basis that their price has been paid. They can get into heaven if they want, but they
Yes.
have to make that decision. And what's been going through my mind lately is our big mistake is that he gave us personal will. We could do what we want, and we're the only thing that keep ourselves out of heaven. We were going to heaven once, and then there was original sin, and then he made it possible we could go to heaven again. And it cost him his life. It cost him the incarnation. That's hard for me to believe. He has to be a man for eternity. That's kind of definitely a degrade. Be like, us creating some sort of robot and becoming a robot to save the robots, So
That's an interesting thought.
yeah, I'm kind of a person that if you give me a chance, I'll think through all possibilities and come up with something I think is feasible. My mother was like that too. My mother was always saying, "Do you think animals could talk before the fall?" Says, "Why?" It says, "Well, Eve didn't think it was strange the snake was talking to her. And Balaam's ass talked to him. So that might have been just breaking through the fall and going back the way things were supposed to be." So that's anyway, you you can take that part out if you want.
No, I actually think it's interesting, and it shows people a bit about how you think. So it doesn't bother me.
I come by it naturally. My mother was honestly an intercessor and and she was always praying for things to happen. I mean, she took it very seriously. She prayed for revival and prayed for people and prayed for my dad. And, she was really the energy behind a lot of things. She, if anybody was going to tell my dad in a meeting, I don't think so, John. It was my mom, right?
Absolutely.
And she was the one that would be sitting there and say, "I don't believe that."
Yeah.
And in front of hundreds of people. So that was my mom,
Yeah,
And honestly, I do remember the conversations where my dad say, "Carol," my mom would be saying, "What you're going to do is going to change the whole world, the whole church." And he'd go, "Do you know how big the world is? Like, what are you being crazy?" He says, "No, I know it's true." And honestly, if in retrospect, has what my dad taught and what was the message from God to him and what God did through him, did it change the whole church? I think it did. I think at least it took away some of the divisions and some of the things. Now, do I think there's God's going to keep doing stuff. And wasn't my dad's thing. If you knew anything about my dad, he knew it was God. He knew everything was God. He knew that all that he taught came from God. He knew that God was the boss, and if God had chosen to take it away from him that next day and give it to somebody else, he would have accepted that.
Right.
I mean, I know for sure that's true.
Right.
And I know that because I lived through him, through all the things he went through, when he was recovering from having a heart attack, and when he had his, the cancer and everything, he tried to give it all away because he just was too tired.
Yes.
And God didn't let him, and he just kept doing it anyway. And during the time he was dealing with his heart attack, he was truly sleeping 18 hours a day. And they'd take him to church, and he would be able to preach and be able to do everything. And then he would go home and sleep. And that was it. That was just his life. But he never complained about it. He never complained. Now, unlike me, I complain about everything. He didn't complain about any of that stuff. And he was just real the whole way through. And which is the one thing that he never got religious. He never came up with a formula. He tried to teach people how to do things. So he'd come up with formulas that we never used. The 5-step healing model. We all learned that, but none of us actually do it. I mean, we don't follow it. We do it because it gives us a chance to hear from God about but I don't think in all the time I was doing ministry team that I got the information I was going to use from that 5-step interview. I got it all from God. And then by the time they were done talking, I had enough time to hear from God and it wasn't on purpose. I mean, I would have prayed for it, but it seemed what was more appropriate was what God was telling me.
Well, I know when I teach that model to this day, I tell people this is like training wheels. This is how you get started. If you don't know where to begin, you don't know what to do with this person who's in front of you, use this. But at any point, if God speaks, throw this away and go with what God does.
Yeah, and you find that once you start to hear, it becomes just like second nature.
Right.
And one of the things that's happened in my life is that God told me, he said, you are who you are, just be who you are all the time. So when I'm going through life and I hear somebody say, oh, I blew out my knee, I say, can I pray for you? And I pray for them right then. And then I talk to them about business. I'm a pool man, so I walk into people's backyards. I talk to them about their pump. I pray for their illnesses, and I tell them to add this chlorine in 2 days, that kind of thing. It's just my life.
Yeah.
And God has been very gracious to just make me always the same. I get to be always the same. I walk into a real story. I walked in. This is an older woman, a widow, and she came out and she says, my doctor says I got this biopsy on my tongue. And I'm thinking, nobody wants to have tongue cancer. That would be a bad thing. Nope. So before I get a chance to even think what comes out of my mouth, it's not cancer. And she said, what? I said that it's not cancer, but I didn't say it really. It was God who said it. And she says, really? I said, yeah, I don't know how else to explain it. It didn't go through my brain. It only came out my mouth. I didn't think it first before I said it. I said, so let me know what your doctor says when he does the biopsy. So she comes out and she's very excited the next week. And she says, my doctor said it sure looked like cancer, but it's just benign. And I thought, well, isn't that, I don't think that was the healing point. I think that was to try to relieve her tension. I don't know. Maybe it was cancer and it wasn't after I said that. I don't know. But it's not cancer was what came out of my mouth. And that was it. But it's just because that's who I am. If the same thing happened, a friend came over, or I was at church, or if I'm in the grocery store and something seems like this is the appropriate thing to do, let's pray for this person, I do that. And you know what it's like in Southern California. There's a lot of people who think you need to stay in your lane, they say. Well,
yes.
But the lane isn't in the church. The lane for me is in me. So if wherever I am, here I am, the church,
Yeah, I get it. I totally get it. And really what you're describing is what your dad used to call naturally supernatural. It's just,
yeah. Yeah. Or even down to power evangelism, because ultimately it's a lot easier for people to accept a God that's that practical. They're going to heal. I got to tell you, it makes it a lot easier to get somebody into church if you just heal their kid. I mean, really. And that's what I kind of think. The one thing that I was very excited about is the idea of releasing kids to go preach to their mates at school, to bring them to the Lord. And it's one of the things they talked about in one of the workshops at this thing. That's what I've been looking for. I've been looking for a way to release people. Go out there and just do it. Just preach, just talk to everybody, invite anybody to Jesus and see who comes.
Right.
And eventually, maybe we can start another Jesus people movement. Maybe we'll start another thing that we will get people back going back to where they're supposed to be, back to Jesus.
Amen. So, on that point, Tim, you made a comment a little while back on this in this conversation, that your parents prayed you would not go into the ministry. And then you made a follow-up comment that, okay, now that your mom is gone, you feel a little more liberty. What are you and Sharon doing these days in terms of your ministry direction? How are you giving life to that now that you don't have your parents praying against it?
Well, honestly, one of the things that I really think that for me is that I never marketed myself out there. I never tried to do the itinerant preacher thing.
Yeah.
Because I knew that my dad definitely wouldn't approve, and I think that my mom, the reason why she admitted that was the case is because she kind of realized what she'd done. But now, yeah, I'm thinking, well, I mean, I'm your age, and so how it feels. It's not easy sleeping in hotels, and it's not easy traveling on planes all around the world. But now I think I'm supposed to do it, and I think that God isn't going to have somebody give me a few $1,000,000 so I can take it out of my surplus. I think God's going to make me pay to go around the world to preach and to heal and to do all these things. And I think the word is that I think that as Christians, whether we knew it or not, we joined an army. We have to not want to be representatives of Christ is insubordination. I think that we need to be representative. It says we are. Says where it talks about we're supposed to make disciples of all nations. Okay, what did Jesus do with his disciples? He sent them out and told them to do what he was doing, and they did it, and they were all so surprised that it worked. Well, that's kind of what I think happens to us. I think if we are obedient to God and send people out, if every one of us go out and have some ministry, some outreach, it will make us healthier. I mean, every church has to be a school. We have to be educated. Every church has to be a hospital because we're all broken. But every church also is an army, and we're called to duty. And so instead of everybody gets to play, I'm starting to say that everybody should play. Everybody should take your chances at embarrassment and say what the impressions that you're getting and see if God doesn't do miracles. One of the things people really honestly think is that my dad would walk up on stage and he would have all this locked down. You were close enough to him. You probably saw his notes a few times. There would be like 4 words you couldn't read on the back of a napkin, and that was his notes for the talk. I mean, he didn't know. He got all those words of knowledge at the moment, like we all do. It was all by impression. Nothing was clearer for him than it was for us. But he looked so good because he looked so calm saying it all.
Yep.
But honestly, I think that we all operate on the same it seems to me, the longer I know the Lord, the more quiet I have to make my spirit to hear him. Yeah, he gets quieter. Maybe it's maybe as you get older, you get hard of hearing, but I really have to focus and try to turn off all my emotion to hear from God. And if I'm worried about looking bad, if I'm worried about embarrassing myself, then it's just going to make it harder for me to hear him. So now I've just decided, well, I'm already old. What can they say that's going to affect me? If I've embarrassed myself, it's too late. I don't mind being weird for the rest of my life. I don't mind at least if I pray for somebody, even if they don't get healed, at least I prayed for them. I was showing a certain amount of affection and love for them. If I care about them enough to pray for them, that might be a healing thing in itself, just loving people.
Yep.
So
That's another thing that your dad used to say, that even if they don't get healed, if we show them love, we fulfilled the greatest commandment.
Yeah. And, it's not like Jesus didn't pick. Okay, you probably know this better than I do, but God always picks the wrong person for the job. He made Peter be the apostle to the Jews, and he had Paul be the apostle to the Gentiles. Paul was the educated one. He was the Pharisee, but they didn't care. The Greeks didn't care about him being a Pharisee. Yeah, but the Jews would have been impressed. And Peter was a fisherman. He was probably, the equivalent of a, construction worker in that kind of mentality. If you've ever seen fishermen that fish with nets, they're burly guys, the big
Yep.
fingers, probably breaking them. And, that's probably what Peter looked like. And yet God did what we wouldn't have done. God has told me I'm supposed to do something that is really against my nature. I'm not a person who ever wants attention. Matter of fact, my biggest fear is for people to know who I am and recognize me on the street and me have to deal with their adulation just from being Tim Wimber. I don't want to be Tim Wimber. I want to be anonymous. If you can get me down to anonymous, then I would be happier. I just don't enjoy attention.
Yeah.
So if I'm, and God keeps showing me things where I think a lot of people would really like it. God gave me a thing where it's a vision that seemed real to me at the time, where I'm standing on a stage in a stadium, and I think I'm going to talk next. And I'm thinking I wish I would have spent more time studying, is what I'm really thinking. But they're singing that song, where you go, I'll go. What you say, I'll say. What you pray, I'll pray. Jesus could only do what he saw you do. And that song, I thought, oh, I must be. I was so worried. Like, what did the Vineyard bring to the world? Well, the one thing it brought is body ministry. And 20 years ago, that song would have made no sense at all, because ministry didn't happen in the body. Ministry happened by the select. It was priests and superstars that prayed for people. Now we all pray for people. So I want it to be an anonymous people. I really do. And that was kind of talked about a lot. I think that a faceless people is what we've got to raise up. I want people to ask for generic. I need a Christian, not some name.
Yeah.
Because Christians hear from God and they know what to say. And that's what we got to do. We got to hope that we can become that. We can become good enough. We can have ears to hear and eyes to see what the Spirit's doing.
Well, that's a very empowering message that you have just thrown out there. We don't.
Well, it's what I think I'm building my future on. I think that if I have anything to say, that's the one thing I have right now to say, is that it's not, I don't want people to follow me, because I'm I spent my whole life trying to figure out where I'm going. So I don't have a real sense of direction, but I do know that I'm supposed to do what's in front of me.
Yeah.
And you can't do what's in front of me. I have to do what's in front of me because it's in front of me. So let's all find what God's putting in front of us. And let's all do what we're supposed to do in God's eyes. And we are supposed to be represented. I mean, there's all those stories in the Gospels that Jesus saw them and had compassion on them and healed the sick. Well, don't you want to live that life? Don't you want it to be where there are Christians everywhere in the world seeing people and having compassion on them and healing them and changing them? That's the way it should be. We should be so excited about what God did for us and how he saved us and took us, that we would want to bring everybody else he paid for with us.
Yeah.
I mean, really. And let's truly make disciples of all nations. Let's try to get everybody going the same direction to heaven, instead of letting people decide to go to hell. Because you almost have to decide to go to hell. Hopefully if you put them in a place where they can make a decision, yes, I go to heaven, no, I go to hell, they'll say yes. It's already been paid for. It's already done. The ticket's there. You don't have to, it doesn't cost them anything, except for what it was costing them anyway. Right. I mean, it's costing them their lives, but yes. So that's kind of that's where I'm at right now. In a few months, I'm going to take a large ministry trip and kind of try to teach this to South Africans. So that's kind of going to be my message.
I think that'll be a very powerful message. I'll look forward to that.
I really hope so.
Yeah.
I've not tried it out.
If people want to get in touch with you, perhaps to invite you to come and speak at their churches, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
Would you mind them reaching out to you and you can just forward me anything?
Sure, that's fine. If you want to
I run a business, and it goes everywhere, and so people will delete it because it's not pool business.
I understand. That's fine. So if you are interested in inviting Tim to speak at your fellowship, send an email to info@orbisministries.org, ORBIS ministries.org, info@orbisministries.org. All right. Well, Tim, this has been great. I'm so grateful that you made time to join us today. And I know for a lot of people, this has just been a fascinating conversation about you and your own development, and also given some sidelights on your mom and dad. But, it's time for you to step into your own role in the world. You are starting to do that, and it's going to be great to see that develop. We'll have you back in a few months to hear how it's going.
Okay, that'd be wonderful.
All right. Well, everybody, this is the end of our broadcast, and join us next week at the same time, same place, for another episode of God is Not a Theory.
If you are blessed by the content on this podcast, please pay it forward and click on the donation link in the description of this episode. To support Ken directly, you can select the Ken Fish Support Fund. Or, if you would like to give to support the rest of the team, select the General Fund. Thank you so much for your consideration. We are deeply grateful to all of our financial partners.